This is probably my favorite piece of advice for composers and creatives. And actually, I've written a book on this. It's very short, it's a quick read, but it's my favorite tips, advice, and skills needed for writing more music and writing better music. And it's completely free, so you can click the link in the description if you're interested in reading that book. But this video is gonna look in detail at one of my favorite pieces of advice from that book. Enjoy. How do we significantly boost our creativity? I find that often when we're starting a big creative project, say composing a big piece of music, something like that, it can be overwhelming. There's this sense that we don't know what direction to go in, and you can almost get this real decision fatigue. There are almost too many possibilities. There are infinite different directions that you could go in, and it means it's really hard to decide which path to choose. Where do I go? How do I move forwards when there's so many different things that I could do? I've definitely had this before, where I've been stopped dead in my tracks by this decision fatigue, this inability to decide how to move forwards, because I know that there are so many different possibilities. So how do you go from there to a state of flow where things are moving ahead really nicely? Recently, I heard a quote that really resonated with me, and that quote was, "Resources are the enemy of creativity." Resources are the enemy of creativity. So when you have a ton of resources, infinite options, you might think that that's a great thing. But that can also mean that there's no structure to your thought. There's no guiding structure which will actually give you a clear direction of how to move forwards. When you have infinite resources, there's almost too many options, too many different ways you could go, and it becomes very difficult to make a full-on final decision on things. Having too many resources can actually be a curse rather than a blessing. However, when you lack resources, you have to be resourceful in yourself. You have to become resourceful in order to solve new challenges. And in that respect, by becoming resourceful, limitations can actually boost your creativity. So I'm going to give you a sort of analogy here. Imagine Shakespeare, or imagine some epic poem like Paradise Lost by Milton. When Milton was writing Paradise Lost, he had to write in iambic pentameter. Well, he didn't have to, but he decided to write in iambic pentameter. That's using 10 syllables per line with a certain stress pattern. And he also committed to a certain regular rhyming pattern. And so he writes like this for thousands of lines, committing to just 10 syllables per line and a very regular rhyming pattern. Thousands of lines of poetry. And by doing so, he wrote one of the most epic and famous poems in all of Western literature. Now, he could have written that in free prose. He could have just written whatever came to him, however he wanted, using any old sentence structure or anything. But instead, he restricted himself to only 10 syllables per line and a certain structure of beats. And that meant that he had to choose his words very carefully. He had to choose his metaphors very carefully. He had to choose words which rhyme in a certain way, and it governed the entire structure of his poem. It forces him to be really concise with his metaphors and his ideas. But as a creative work of art, it's so much more powerful because his restrictions forced him to be more creative. Or let's give another completely different example. Take Jurassic Park. So in the early 1990s, CGI technology really wasn't that advanced, and Steven Spielberg had to create a realistic looking T-Rex. And ironically, having those limitations where you didn't have infinite resources, you had to find a way to create a realistic looking dinosaur using only the tools available to you. Because of these limitations, it forced him and his team to think outside the box, and actually it made that T-Rex seem a lot more real than the modern films. In the modern films, they had almost unlimited resources to make it happen. And yet, because Spielberg and his team had to think outside the box and use the tools available to him, the early T-Rex seems that much more real. You could do this with music too. A lot of people want to write for these big, epic symphony orchestras. Okay, that's great. But what if you were to restrict yourself to only 4 voices, right? If you're left with, say, a choir, and you can only use 4 voices, you're never allowed to use more than 4 notes at once. Now that is an interesting restriction. That makes you really have to think about what notes you're using. You have to think about what each note is doing, and it makes the whole challenge more exciting in a way. Or if you wanted a slightly easier challenge, you could use no more than 6 voices or 8 voices. 4 voices is hard mode, because now you've got to tell a story with serious limitations, and it really makes you realize the importance of every single note. And that's what a string quartet is as well, is writing for only 4 instruments. And so a string quartet for a composer is a real challenge. They have to be as concise and emotionally compact as possible and still produce an amazing piece of music with only 4 instruments. These limitations actually force us to be more creative and often to write better music, because we have to be creative problem solvers in order to figure out how to use these limitations to our advantage. I actually learned this lesson very early on. So the first thing I ever composed publicly was for a school play. My teacher had me compose the music for Death of a Salesman. And in that script, it calls for music for flute, just a solo flute. And there needs to be Willy Loman's theme. Willy Loman is the main character. And he needs a theme which speaks of nostalgia for his youth and for his father and, the life that he wants versus the life that he thinks he wants. And you have to tell this whole story through a theme using only a flute. Nothing else but one melody line on the flute. And that really forces you to be creative. How do I tell this story? How do I add to this drama with only one line, with only one instrument? That, in some ways, is a far more interesting challenge than saying, you have infinite resources, make it happen, you can use all the instruments that ever existed. No, you have to use a flute. And you have to tell this story with only one flute. And I've done challenges like this since, and it's been some of my favorite composing experiences. Say, you have to compose music using only sounds that you can find online for free, or you have to write music using only instruments and sounds that you can find around the house, that kind of thing. It really narrows your focus and challenges your creativity in a very rewarding way. It forces you to think outside the box. It forces you to approach a problem with more creativity than you would have done otherwise. And it doesn't have to be just for instrumentation too. So I recently got this score. This is Back to the Future by Alan Silvestri. And I started studying it and marking it up. And I realized that so much of this music is written using an 8-note scale, the octatonic scale. There are whole swathes of music where he's only using 8 notes in the scale. And he's not using a single note that doesn't belong in that scale. So in that sense, his limitations are tonal. He's only allowed to use these 8 notes, and he's not allowed to use the notes which don't belong in that scale. And because he has those limitations, it really focuses that music and makes it really exciting. And so I've done the same as well. Back in December, I was doing this composing challenge, you might remember, and I decided to limit myself to an 8-note scale. And I wasn't allowed to use a single note that didn't belong in that scale. Initially, I was really stuck on this challenge because I felt like there are so many different directions to go in, I don't know where to go next. But when I limited it down, when I cut everything down to just 8 notes, it actually made me more creative, and it actually made the harmony more adventurous. Saying that I'm not allowed to use these notes made it more exciting and more interesting. You'd think that I would have made my own life harder, but actually the opposite happened. Composing became easier. It was as if the world suddenly opened up and I had a clear path forwards. The music started to become more harmonically adventurous and more creatively fulfilling because of the limitation. So the next time you're trying to do something creative, think about that quote. Resources are the enemy of creativity. Or conversely, limitations can massively boost creativity. This is one of the many things that I've discovered while composing recently. And so I've actually put together a very short ebook of top composing tips. This is one of them, but there's a whole bunch more as well. If you want to check that out and download it, you can find a link in the description. It's completely free, so if you want some of my top tips for writing more music and getting in a great creative state, then check that out. It's completely free and there's a link in the description. It's my gift to you, so I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you very soon.